Hi, all. So I'm going to give a background on this unit. You should take notes on this. You can use your historical thinking chart or just take notes in your notebook. So first, I'm going to do an overview of this period. We're between 1450 and 1750, and we already gave a name to this period of time. It comes after the medieval era, and it is the early modern era. So we looked at a bunch of great societies during that time. You guys did your posters, the Mughals, um, China, the Incas over in the Americas, the Italian Renaissance, the Dutch and Northern European Renaissance, and the Ottomans. So there are a lot of incredible societies at this time. And like we did with the medieval era, we're also going to look at how they encountered each other and what that meant. Now, this encounter is often going to happen in a different way. So, in the second part of the discussion, we're going to look at not only why Portugal, but also why did Spain and how did Spain take such an important role in this story? Why this time period, and how and why did European conflicts and colonial wars connect to each other and to this entire age of encounters? Okay, we saw in the previous part the role of the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, leading Europeans to search out other trade routes to the wealthy areas of Asia. Okay, now Spain really comes into the story in 1492. And there are a few reasons why 1492 is such an important year. Okay, now the one you may know is that this is the year that Columbus sails the ocean blue, that Columbus travels from Spain uh, into the Americas to the Caribbean. He never actually makes it to mainland United States. Um, Second reason was that 1492 was the year that Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, they were married royal couple. She was the more important of the two. She was the queen of the center part of Spain called Castile, which is where Madrid is and which is where the Spanish that we get, Castellano, is from, but also King Ferdinand of Aragon. They united their kingdoms and they ended up finishing what was called the Reconquista, the reconquering of all of Spain from the North African Muslims who had controlled southern Spain for hundreds of years. After these wars of conquest, they finally reconquered Granada, the southern part. After that was done, that meant that you had, first of all, Spain was united and could um, give its royal support to explorations rather than to military conquests. You also had a lot of young men who had gone off into these wars and who now had time and experience to go on these explorations. Um, and lastly, in 1492 was the beginning of what was called the Inquisition. Well, no, actually, I'm sorry. The Inquisition didn't start then. It was the expulsion of all Jews and Muslims from Spain. Um, many, there's actually new evidence that many of those Jews who were expelled from Spain as Ferdinand and Isabella kind of developed this idea that a nation had to be of one nationality, of one religion, of one unified group of people. And they viewed Jews as a different race of people. It's really a fascinating and tragic story. Many of them, these Sephardic Jews or Spanish Jews, had lived there for hundreds of years. Their families, they're thrown out. That many go to the Ottoman Empire, to which was much more tolerant, but they. This also leads to the Inquisition, which some of you studied in your research papers, where many of them converted to Christianity to be able to stay in Spain, but they secretly practiced their traditional Jewish religion. They were called conversos, converted people. And the Inquisition was actually trials of heretics. Now, the word heretic is someone of your own religion who is not practicing it correctly. Okay, so since these were now technically Christians who were secretly, some of them, practicing Judaism, they were viewed as Christian heretics, um, and therefore brought into trial. So, with all of these things going on in 1492, Spain emerges as a unified, nationally, religiously, with a sense of mission, and their monarchs now support Columbus's exploration. Okay. Um, this leads today to an interesting question of whether we should celebrate Columbus Day as we've traditionally done, or Indigenous Peoples Day, which is what the holiday has been renamed, rebranded for many people. What might be the reasons to continue to call it Columbus Day, or to switch to talk about it as Indigenous Peoples Day? Many places like Scarsdale, I believe, kind of use both of them today. Uh, all right. Um, as Spain and Columbus make it over to the Americas, and Portugal had already been in the midst of all of this exploration of Africa and um, Asia, there was some potential conflict between Spain and Portugal over these lands that they realized they would eventually want to conquer. So they asked the Pope to mediate, the head of the Catholic Church. And in 1494, he brokers a treaty called the Treaty of Tordesillas, in which they basically divide the world in half of all of the new lands that are being discovered. So, not counting Europe and Asia, which they viewed as already being kind of settled civilizations. Um, Everything to the west of the line would go to Spain, and everything to the east of the line would go to Portugal. And you can see, in terms of like the Americas, that that's kind of how it ends up, with the western part being eventually a Spanish colony, and the eastern part being a Portuguese colony of Brazil. The Portuguese gained much more land in Africa and in Asia than the Spanish. And the Spanish, of course, eventually start off the colonialism in North America, in Mexico, in California, Florida, uh, New Mexico, the whole area of the West. Eventually, they'll renegotiate the treaty a bit, but this kind of sets the stage for this period, this first wave of global colonialism across the ocean. Um, so in this map here, you can see how in the year 1600, uh, in the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia, it's really Spain and Portugal that are leading the way for Europe. Okay. Um, Russia is beginning to expand a land empire, okay, not a maritime one. Now, why don't they do the maritime? They don't really have the sea routes, the sea culture. Much of their waters are frozen over for a good part of the year. So they're expanding by land. And England, know this, this is the red is expanding as well, but it's taking over parts of Ireland and Scotland. Those are England's first example of colonialism, and these are brutal wars of conquest as well. You can also see Spain um, owns small pieces of east of France, which is Belgium and the Netherlands, as well as pieces of Italy as well. And that's going to be really important for understanding how things change a little bit later. By 1660, we have a couple of new countries on the global stage. One is the Netherlands. France, which is taking parts of North America, what is known as Quebec, and where they still speak French today. Great Britain has started to gain a bit of a hold in the North America lands, as well as Belize and a few places. And India, we can see, is kind of dotted. There were actually agreements that of different countries that would get different ports in India as well. So we see now there's a competition. Russia's expanded all the way across the east to the Pacific Ocean, and we can see the beginnings of the Russia that we know today. Okay. Um, and then by 1754, we can see an expansion of France in North America, of the British in North America. The beginning, we can really see Spanish Latin America and Brazil taking shape, different countries having coastal areas of Africa, India really being divided up on the coast, but not in the interior. And Russia is the Russia that we know. Okay. Um, so, two pieces I want to bring out today. One is, and we're going to get to this in later units, there's something happening in Europe called the Reformation, which is where Protestants emerge in Germany. Okay. This leads, so now there are two main branches of Christianity in Central and Western Europe: Catholics and Protestants. There's also the Eastern Orthodox in Ukraine, Russia, Greece, etc. Okay. This leads to a number of wars, which we're going to discuss, okay, between Catholics and Protestants. And they're often fighting wars against each other in Europe, but these wars extend their competition to their new colonies in the Americas and in Asia, because these colonies are a huge source of wealth. So if they can gain more colonies, or if they can take colonies away from each other, that will give them great strength in their wars against each other in Europe itself. So we see this play out in a couple of places. One, we just mentioned, the Netherlands emerges as a global power despite it, like Portugal, being a really small country. Why does this happen? A few of you guys did research papers on this. The Dutch and Belgium were controlled by Spain. Spain was a Catholic country, but many in the Netherlands became Protestant, uh, called the Dutch Reformed Church. So the Dutch rebel against Spain for a number of reasons. One of them is a religious reason. Spain were Catholics, Dutch were Protestants, but also they didn't like their taxation and some forms of repression, etc. Okay. So the Dutch rebel against them. And one of the great ways, here, this was me at my Dutch conference earlier in the year with one of the great Dutch historians. The Dutch, well, before I get to that, the Dutch were known for being a really unique society. This is my favorite history book of all time, called The Island of the Center of the World by Russell Shore, though. The Dutch were known for trade, for religious toleration, for accepting diversity, including having one of the only place in Europe where Jews could practice their religion freely. Intellectual freedom, so many printing presses. Um, Later on, Enlightenment thinkers from England and France would flee England and France to publish in the Netherlands, and art like Rembrandt and Vermeer. Um, so in 1580, we can see here the Dutch Netherlands were part of Spain, just like parts of Italy, but they rebel, and this leads to the 80 Years' War, I believe. There's so many of these numbered wars, but it's 80 Years' War of Independence against Spain. Okay, that's going to have drastic consequences for the world, because Spain and Portugal have joined in a union together. And so the Dutch figure out, in order to hurt Spain and Portugal, one of the best ways to do that would be to attack their colonies. Okay. And in 1621, the Dutch form a company, the Dutch West India Company, that is literally a company like Amazon, but that also has an army. Okay. And they're chartered by the government to colonize, to fight against Spain, and to conquer lands. Okay. And they figure out that the best way to fight against Spain, first of all, is to capture Spain's treasure fleet. So they send a pirate out. His name is Pietine. He's a chartered pirate. Those are called privateers. And Spain had got each year gathered its huge treasure fleet from the Americas in Cuba, and Piet Hein figured out in Havana, Cuba, where and when the treasure fleet would gather. He captures the treasure fleet in one swoop, gains all of this huge amount of wealth from silver from Bolivia and elsewhere, takes it back to the Netherlands, to the West India Company, and then they can use this to fund two new attempts at colonization. One is going to be in North America in a place called New Amsterdam, and the other one is going to be they're going to conquer the Portuguese parts of the Portuguese colony in Brazil that is really wealthy from the sugar trade. So it's through this piracy that actually New Amsterdam and eventually New York is founded, with many of the characteristics of Amsterdam itself, of the Dutch trade, religious toleration, diversity, all the things that New York is known for, and also northeastern Brazil. Okay, so pirates are really an interesting and true part of history. You can see my picture book coming out next year, which is based on the story of inspired by the story of a real uh, pirate rabbi. So in 1630, the Dutch, as part of these global colonial wars to fight against Spain and Portugal, they conquer northeastern Brazil and establish a really wealthy sugar colony there. Also, based on Dutch culture, very tolerant compared to Portuguese Brazil towards the Native Americans, towards Jews who had fled there. Um, and uh, yeah, so as I said, all part of this 80 years war of independence against Spain and Portugal. A similar thing happens in North America, where the Dutch and the British fight a number of wars against each other. Those are wars happening in England and the Netherlands back in Europe. But in order to fight these wars, they try to attack each other's colonies. So the Dutch had New Netherlands. New Amsterdam was their capital in modern day Manhattan. So the British, in order to weaken the Dutch to fight these Anglo-Dutch wars, end up conquering their wealthy territory of New Netherland, which was based on the fur trade, beaver fur, which was a really important trade to make beaver hats at the time. The British conquer New Netherland, and that is how New Amsterdam eventually became a New York became British, as you know, it would maintain until independence in 1776, but that it becomes an English speaking area as opposed to Dutch, but maintains some of the cultural diversity, toleration, trade that the Dutch were so well known for. So the big idea here being and the 7 Years' War as well, where the British and French were fighting against each other. We know the 7 Years' War as the French and Indian War. That's when the British conquered, uh, really drove the French out of Eastern North America. They conquered Quebec, and all of Canada became British rather than became French, and that will eventually uh, lead to have implications for the French Revolution, which we'll talk about later, as well as for American independence. So this was a lot here, but it's setting the stage for all of these global and especially Atlantic encounters. We haven't talked about Native Americans yet, and how they're impacted in so many ways. We'll discuss this. Africans and Europeans all encountering each other in various ways across the Atlantic, and of course, Europeans are also arriving into Asia. We'll dig much deeper into all of this, but I find personally fascinating how the wars in Europe end up really influencing who owns what colonies and where, and how colonies change hands in the Americas.